Jag förstår att ni har hela tiden pratat om det som vi pratar om här och funderat på frågorna som ni fick med er och sådär. Så nu så blir det väl spännande. Ja, nu så funkar det bra här. Nu tror de till och med att det har börjat. Det blir alldeles tyst. Ja, men det är bra. Just det. Det gjorde gott. Nu ska jag sluta här, va?
Conversation of the break time. They're important times as well. The breaks are very much a part of the pedagogy. But I'm going to invite my colleagues Magnus and Skander to respond and add to what I've been saying and clarify or deepen and whatever. And then I'm very curious, as you listen, I'm very curious to how you respond to that second question. What's the very best thing we have by way of appealing to our youth? What's the creme de la creme, the most attractive feature of Christian faith by far, and especially to youth and young adult? Please.
I don't think me and Magnus have some sort of universal answer to this first question, but try to draw from some of our experience. And some ways and some approaches that we have used is so we're going to share. One aspect that we think is very important is to invite the young people to participate in the group. We want to avoid a form of monologue. Mr. Groome here is a good example of that. We want the young kids to be able to share their stories, their fears, their hopes, and be able to do that in a setting where a leader is setting that tone and modeling how that conversations should be like.
So the first value or the idea that we have has to do with delaktighet in Swedish. Participate, precis. Participate. The second value for us has to do with relationer. It has to do with connect with the youth in a great way, in a deep way, in a spiritual way. And connect their questions with the questions or the answers or the stories of the Bible, and connect their questions with to connect it with each other, and like the moderator, the moderator for the relations is the leader. I would say the moderator of the progress of the group is the leader.
Thank you. You can bring this with you.
Yes, sure. Sorry.
Other thoughts,
comments, insight?
other ways that you have found effective to appeal to youth and young adult with Christian faith yourself? Maybe we'd borrow. Thank you, Skander.
We had a discussion here in the break because we thought that this is indeed very interesting, but also what we feel where we work is that very many of the youth that we meet, they have no relationship to Christian faith at all, or very weak. So we're not even close to talking so much about Christian faith with them. It's very, very much about building a relationship. And I mean, it's a gift, of course. I work in the Church of Sweden, that we have so many young people coming to us. I mean, they're not members in that sense, like in the parish, and they have no strong connection, but that they still come and they're still curious. But that means that a lot of the work that we do is very strongly centered around this relationship.
Sure.
That what I have listened to here, the hour before, I can very strongly see, oh yes, I can preach this, with my youth leaders. If they have been like 5 years in our work, that's when I can start to talk about this.
Okay.
So I feel very strongly that we sort of need to talk something about step 1. You are talking very much about step 2.
Okay, or maybe even step 3 or 4. No, I think you make a wonderful point. I mean, the old language for what you're talking about was we need to do pre-evangelization.
Exactly.
If you just jump in and start telling them about Jesus, it might be a total turn-off. But when we get to how to go about it, I will reclaim a little of that. There has to be a whole pre-evangelizing, preparing of the soil. And as Skander or Marcus said, a lot of that is building relationships and becoming friends with them and letting them know that you care about them and that they're welcome here and that they are respected and that their questions are important and that they should be asking them and that you welcome them doing so, etc., etc., etc. Then there will be moments, but you'll have to be very alert and very astute when you can put in a word of God.
And I think for me also a key word would be this with being authentic, because that's very. I think it's a very key word for our whole society today, but especially among young people, that you feel that you have an authentic relationship, that I have an authentic conviction that my faith is somehow coming from my heart and it's not about dogmatics.
No, it's great. No, if you remember the old Barthians and the Neo-Barthians, those of you who've been to seminary, studied Barth, I mean, in a sense, he thought that the word was powerful in and of itself. And it has a power to it. But if you just proclaim the word without preparing the soil, it'll fall on deaf ears. But there are ways to prepare the soil, and you're saying that very well, by way of building relationship and engaging their lives. The stuff that matters, what Paulo Freire would call the generative themes. If we can get into the generative themes, and that were some of them I was trying to name this morning, of their lives, and then come into that with something of Christian wisdom, then there's a possibility. Yeah, great comment. Another comment somebody would like to share with us? We'll take one more before we move on. Another insight or a wisdom you want to give us? Yes, thank you.
For me, as a Christian, I feel that the free churches, like here in Sweden, are about very, like 200 years old. And for me to develop myself as a leader, I feel the urge to jump like 100 years back and like take the sources from like Ignatian spirituality. I think to grow and develop my own spirituality in order to keep it alive and to find good things, practical ways to hand on faith. I found that Ignatian spirituality would fit perfectly to youth work today.
It's a wonderful one. Thank you so much. But you make a powerfully important point. If the salt loses its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? In other words, if we don't keep our salt salty, if we don't nurture our own faith, then, well, Luke says we're just fit for the dung heap. We get thrown out on the dung heap. So I think Christian ministers and people in Christian ministry, if this is to work, and to go back to your comment about, if they don't see us as somewhat authentic to this faith, they'll see through us right away. So, and it's not that we have to be perfect. How many of you are as good as you sound? Huh? See, none of us are. But you better be trying to live the Christian life and the gospel, or these kids will see through you right away. But the only way you can maintain that saltiness is by your own good spiritual practices. If you don't have a habit of some kind of prayer every day, I don't think you can stay the course. And I know. I've tried it both ways. But you can't sustain it. And and there's all kinds of rich practices. And who cares whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or whatever you are? Draw the resources from wherever you can find them. So Ignatian spirituality is a very rich spirituality. And it has a whole tradition of having a spiritual mentor yourself, a soul friend. I have an old woman that's dear holy nun. I go see her every month. Not because I'm doing so well, but she beats up on me every month, you know. How are you doing? And pushes back against me and asks me all kinds of good questions. But she holds me accountable to my own faith journey. And we have to do that ourselves, or else we'll be a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. So nurturing, keeping our own salt salty. Do you know that? That's the echo from the scriptures? Is imperative for us. Let's push on. What's the greatest? What might be our very best mode of appeal to young people? Well, of course, they need to know all the great truths, all the great spiritual wisdoms and practices, the great values that come down to us through Scripture and Christian tradition. They need to know the whole story. Eventually, not at the beginning, but the whole vision as well. And by vision, I mean what it means for their lives. If you talk about the Trinity, you'll have to talk about loving relationships. If you talk about Exodus, you'll have to talk about a God who intervenes in human history to set free the oppressed and what that means for us today. If you tell them that God loves them, you'll have to say, and we have to love each other. If you tell them that God forgives them, you have to say, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Every aspect of the Christian story has an implication, an application, an integration for people's lives. Very often we only tell the story. Sometimes in telling the story well, you can also lay out the vision. But I think it's important to be quite explicit about the vision that it's called to. It's fascinating how Jesus does it regularly, especially in John's Gospel. Every time he makes a faith, truth claim about himself, he says what it means for us. I am the good shepherd. I came that you may have life and have it to the full. I am the light of the world. If you walk in this light, you'll never walk in darkness. I am the bread that came down from heaven. The one who eats this bread will live forever. It goes on and on and on. There's always a vision to the story. And helping young people to see that and to integrate that into their lives is terribly important. Otherwise, we're just teaching them about the faith. They're not learning to become it. They're not learning from it. They're simply learning about it. And they're not terribly interested in learning about it. So they need the whole story, the whole vision. But then you say, but what should be our canon within the canon? The defining center of what we give them ready access to. And I have a very obvious answer. It obviously has to be faith in Jesus Christ. And I don't think this just belongs to evangelical people. I think Catholics, Lutherans, all kinds of people have to come to realize that the best thing we've got is Jesus. And especially for our young people. And Jesus the Christ. And there's a whole renewed sense, and for those of you who were with me yesterday, I'm afraid I'm going to repeat myself, of the centrality of Jesus, of the historical Jesus to our faith. Now, it's breaking out all over. There's extraordinary scholarship being done around the new quest for the historical Jesus. Now, there have been many quests already, as you remember from your days in seminary or in theology. But now we're into a new quest that's really emphasizing the radicality of this life. The extraordinary values, the amazing demands, the just totally iconoclastic faith that he was proposing to the world. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, if you could just pardon me, quoting one of my own texts, my own tradition, but it has a great summary. It says, it's not the Bible. Sorry, good Lutherans. It's not the church. Sorry, good Catholics. It's not the law, the commandments, not the sacraments, not the dogmas, the doctrines, the practices. Instead, it says, at the heart, we find a person. And I love how it puts it, the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the only Son from the Father. So we need both. We need the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. The Jesus of history, the one, this Jewish carpenter from Nazareth, who came preaching this inbreaking, this immediate inbreaking of God's reign of unconditional love for all, and yet with a special favor for the least, the lost, and the last, who fed the hungry, cured the sick, expelled evil, and who went into his synagogue, his hometown, on a Sabbath day and searched for the text from Isaiah 61, as Walter Brueggemann says, the most radical text he could have found in the Hebrew Scriptures, and then said, the Spirit of God is upon me and has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim God's year of jubilee, of total munificence, when land lies fallow, debts are forgiven, slaves are set free, when it's the land of heart's desire. The land of heart's desire. The Irish poet William Butler Yeats has a beautiful poem called The Land of Heart's Desire. In many ways it's a description of Jubilee. And said then that this day, this very text is fulfilled in your hearing. And Luke 4 says, and the eyes of all were fixed on him. And I think we have to refix our eyes on the historical Jesus, on the radicalness of it, the challenges of him, the extraordinary values he lived by, the iconoclasm, the false idols he put down, and of course the ultimate one was welcoming all to the table. This amazing inclusivity that he had. And you see it very early in Mark's gospel, which we always take to be the most historical of the four. And then, a few verses later, they begin to plot to kill him because of who he was welcoming to the table. I think they were all at the table. The men, the women, the children. This is Bohdan Piasecki, a great Polish artist, his rendering of the Last Supper. I love it. We've always thought that Leonardo da Vinci took the photo and of course had 12 Florentine noblemen sitting at the table. And we've always thought that's the Last Supper. Couldn't have been. I mean, the Scripture says they were reclining. The Scripture says it was night. The great classic paintings have it in the daytime. So I think this is probably closer to what it looked like. And the women and children, I believe they were there, because of course they wouldn't have been counted, as it says in the miracle of the loaves and fishes, not 5,000 men, not counting women and children. I couldn't imagine Jesus celebrating a meal, at least in the context of Passover. Scholars still disagree, was it a Passover meal or was it not? But it was certainly at Passover time, and his mother is in Jerusalem, because she's at the foot of the cross next day. Can you imagine a good Jewish son getting together with his friends and not having his mom there? Can you imagine a good Jewish mother who would tolerate that kind of behavior from her son? So I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm totally convinced that they were all there. And even if you don't want to take this as the Last Supper, it certainly is it was reflective of all the suppers that he had and meals, and how he brought all to the table, welcomed all to the table, the dignity of all, the value of all, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the sinners, the excluded, the lepers, all welcome to the table. Now, we also need the Christ of faith. The Son of God within this triune Godhead. But then whoever sees me sees the Father. There's a lot of, Taylor and the sociologist says that one of the problems people have with thinking God in our time is that we're just so inept and incapable of thinking universe. Because you see, we used to be able to think cosmos. We had this little world, heaven up there, hell down there, earth here, sun and moon, few stars, bit of a firmament. We used to think that we had a little world, but now this universe that we're blown out into, with billions and billions of galaxies, with millions and millions of stars, we can't think that way. And so a lot of people get overwhelmed by it and say, I just won't think about it. I'll leave God out. But my response is, no, we can't think infinity, but we can think Jesus. And he said it constantly, whoever sees me sees the Father. Today's gospel reading, I and the Father are one. So what is our God like? Our God is like Jesus, with his compassion, inclusivity, welcome, hospitality, radical love, unconditional love, running out to hug prodigals before they apologize, before he knows why they're coming home, etc., etc., etc. Reaching out to the least, the lost, and the last. That's how our God is. And so we know the Christ of faith, and then by his life, death, and resurrection, that he somehow liberates us from the power of sin, from the powers of evil, even from death, that death has now lost his sting. And then, as Paul says, he has risen for us, he has risen with us always until the end of time, that by God's abundant grace in Jesus Christ, that we can at least approximate living as disciples. I think what is happening in our churches as we reclaim Jesus and the centrality of Jesus to Christian faith. Now, I'll go beyond that, of course, because we can't just fall into a little solipsistic me and Jesus. But you see, most of all of our traditions, in one way or another, skipped the historical Jesus. We did fairly well with the Christ of faith. Son of God, second person of blessed Trinity, Lord and Savior, our justification, our salvation, our redemption, or whatever. But we left out the historical Jesus because a lot of the traditional catechisms in all of our churches, including Luther's short catechism of 1529, were based on, the doctrinal elements were based on the Apostles' Creed. So Luther's catechism took each article of the creed and explained it, catechized it. But remember, the Apostles' Creed says, born of the Virgin Mary, and the next line is, suffered under Pontius Pilate. In other words, we left out his life. He was born, he died. But multiplying the loaves and fishes, including the marginalized, curing the sick, driving out evil, raising the dead, compassion for all, justice, peace, all the rest of it. Not a word about it. So all of our traditions, in one way or another, have done poorly by the historical Jesus. There's a new quest for the historical Jesus that's very exciting, and that the scholars are bringing us back to. Elizabeth Johnson is one of my favorites in the United States. It's called Consider Jesus. Another great woman, scripture scholar, Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza, has a wonderful book called In Memory of Her. Lofink's new book. There's all kinds of tremendous scholarship now going around the historical Jesus and reclaiming the radicality of it. Stuff that we didn't notice. That when he has Lazarus go home to Abraham and the rich man go to hell or Hades, whatever, it would have turned people's world upside down, because the assumption was that wealth was a reward for living well and poverty was a punishment for sin. So it was extraordinary for people that the Samaritans stopped, that the prodigals welcomed home. Just amazing stuff. And so we've done poorly by him. But even with the Christ of faith, I think to our youth today, we need new language to speak to their hearts about the Paschal mystery. Now, you may don't overhear me or mishear me when I say this, but I think a lot of our old language has died. It's not that it wasn't true. I'm not denying the truth of it at all. But is it an effective way to communicate with youth and young adult today? To talk to them about their justification? The youth and young adults I know couldn't care less about their justification or their redemption. Or you tell them that they were saved. They say, saved. Saved from what? Saved for what? Now, I believe in our redemption and justification and salvation in the life, dying, and rising of Jesus. But how do we find a language to tap into the hearts and souls of young people to tell that story? I think we have to find new language. And I think it's there. I think it's there in the tradition. This is what Paul did. He kept looking for ways to try to answer the great question, cur deus homo. Anselm's great question, cur deus homo. Why did God become a person? What was God up to in Jesus? And there's many ways of talking about that, many metaphors, many models of atonement. And I think we have to find new ones for today. Maybe liberation, It has possibilities. I still think there's a power in the liberation theologies of our time, Latin American liberation, feminist liberation, African American liberation theology in the United States. I think there's a tremendous possibility that he did set us free. And again, you can quote the scriptures to support any one of these. Galatians 5:1, freedom is what we have. Christ has set us free. Stand then as free people. Do not become slaves again, and so on. So the liberation language, the humanization. He referred to himself constantly as the human one. We often mistranslate it in English as son of man, but it's not a male gender term at all. Huios theos, it's the son of, it's the human one. The human one, the son of the human one. And the scholars debate, what he meant by son, by it, etc. But he kept constantly referring to himself as the human one. Well, maybe he's a powerful source of humanization, of enabling us to make and keep life human, to come, as last Sunday's gospel reading had it, into a fullness of life, that they might have it to the full life. Maybe a flourishing, to tell young people one of the best ways to flourish. Now, because saving their souls, they're not that interested. They are going to heaven. They want to go to college or someplace, but heaven they don't care much about now. But we have to find another language. We can't just give up and communicate according to the mode of the receiver. That it enables the best possible person to emerge in right and loving relationship with God, self, and others. Let me see. I think I'm right. Oops-a-daisy. What do we see? No? Then, of course, you can't just leave it with Jesus. You have to go on from there. Jesus reveals God as ultimate, loving mystery, and yet active among us to effect God's reign on earth as in heaven. A God of love and compassion, justice and peace, in partnership with us, in partnership for us. No cheap grace. As Bonhoeffer, the great Lutheran theologian, warned, there's no cheap grace. I think the favorite Protestant heresy is cheap grace. And the favorite Catholic heresy is good works, as if we can save ourselves by our own efforts. The balance is in the middle. We'll always need God's grace, and yet we are responsible to our side of the covenant. It's a partnership. God won't do it without us. So we have to make our best efforts, but even our best efforts are made by the help of God's grace. I hope I haven't offended anybody's sensitivities by saying that, but I think the two great heresies that are our favorites for Catholics is that you have to save yourself, Pelagianism. For Protestants, or for Lutherans, Bonhoeffer was the great critic of the cheap grace. There is no cheap grace, and yet there is God's unconditional love that's always on offer and always at high tide, etc. Love, compassion. God is love, and not only do we know that God is love, the ultimate mystery and ground of all being. Isn't it fascinating what we claim? That all these great billions and millions and trillions of stars and planets, that the creator and sustainer of it all is in love. With me, with you, with each and every one of us. That God would have to stop being God to stop loving any one of us. It's extraordinary stuff. And then we believe that in time and place, this God became one of ourselves. In this Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, we've never gotten our hearts and heads and around that. The truth of it. It's just amazing stuff what Jesus reveals to us. He's in love. God is love and is in love with us as a triune loving community within God's self and always toward us. God is always a triune loving relationship and outreach in the ordinary and everyday of life, and calling us to so live. And it is the best possible way to live. And then he sends the Holy Spirit, ever present as grace, as God's effective love, outpoured in every life, in the ordinary and the everyday, moving in our hearts and lives to accept and respond to God's love. And then by a spirituality that puts faith to work. In other words, that takes it into the everyday of life, through right and loving relationship with God, self, others, and creation. So in other words, you can't just all say Jesus, it's me and Jesus. No, it flows on from Jesus. The triune God calls us into a Christian community to become church that continues God's liberating work in Jesus Christ. We're sustained by the scriptures and our traditions, the sacraments, the spiritual practices, the whole story. In other words, you go on from Jesus. Rather than just saying there was a heresy actually in the early church called Christomonism. There were people who thought it was just all me and Jesus. Well, no, it's not. And yet, in a deep sense, Jesus is the defining, he's the canon within the canon of our faith. And I think giving young people ready access to him, to the stories of him, and to the radical stories of him, and giving them direct access, in other words, to the scriptures. It's a little ironic to hear an Irish Catholic preaching to Protestants about the original Protestant principle. Proves that God has a sense of humor, doesn't it? But giving them direct access to the scriptures, letting them bring their lives to the text, and the texts back to their lives, and don't water it down. You're going to say?
This was very fast, but okay. I was thinking, because I once tried Detta with my
Youth?
with the youth, yes. And I mean, I think it's a very interesting way of working, with the scripture text and trying to then put their life. But what I realized then is that so many young people, they are not used to this text, and it's very difficult for them to, not only because the text is unknown to them, because they are untrained in hermeneutics, or of course they're untrained in hermeneutics.
Yeah, I do.
It's very difficult for them to
But you see,
something more.
I know. Yeah. But you see, having gotten rid of the magisterium of the church, I think good Protestants often put in place a magisterium of the scholar. Do we need a scholar to explain this to us? I don't think so. I'd give you a better way to go about it by the end of the morning. Because I don't think they're ready for Lectio Divina. But there's a version of it that I think they can do quite readily. I actually came across this originally in third world context, in Lima, Peru, in scripture study, where people went and sat down in base Christian communities and simply talked about their lives and what was going on, who was in jail, who was being arrested, who was out of work, who was hungry, who was sick, who was getting married, who had a baby. They talked about their life. And then at a certain point, after about 45 minutes, maybe an hour of this talking about their life, they turned to a text. But then they deliberately brought their lives to read the text and to interpret the text, having opened their hearts that it might be a word of God. And I'm not kidding, this is a little bit romantic, but some of those poor peasants, I was in a group where only one person could read. The rest were illiterate. But they came up with insights and wisdom from the texts that I've never heard scripture scholars uncover, because they were bringing their lives to the text. Now, that isn't to say then that you take and canonize what they say. So I don't want to reduce the hermeneutics of my faith to the insights of a group of 15-year-old young people. In other words, let them look at their life, let them bring that life to the texts, and then talk about what they hear. But then you'll have something to say as well. In other words, don't fall into a false liberalism where you say, well, that's what you hear, that's fine. No, it's not. It could be cockeyed. It could be off the wall. So, but there'll be a give and take. There'll be a dialectic very often between what they come to see for themselves and what we will propose. But getting them to, I think we have to do both. We have to do both. We've got them to interpret the text themselves, but also to help them to see what the text means for their lives, out of the broader tradition of the church's faith and out of the scholarship that's available to us. We have to do both. It's a great comment. Let me see where we are now. I forget. What do you think of this business of putting Jesus at the center of your faith? Maybe you're sitting there saying, well, thank God Catholics are finally discovering Jesus. Or are you saying, hey, there's something here for all of our churches to recenter the historical Jesus, and especially for our youth and young adults. Marcus's comment earlier that there is that idealism there that could have enormous appeal to young people. It could appeal to their idealism. And what might persuade them to at least learn from Jesus, and maybe even to become disciples to the way, the truth, and the life? How do we make that work? Why don't you take a minute or two? Why don't you write down a note for yourself? Tell me what you're thinking. Write down what you're coming to see for yourself from my ramblings. And we will come back. We'll hear from Marcus and Slander one more time. And then I'll make a proposal for how to go about it before we go to lunch. About 12, what time? 12:30?
5 minutes, about 11:30. And then lunch is 12:30.
Lunch is 12:30. Okay. Well, we'll take a little break about 11:25 for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay. Is there something here about putting Jesus at the heart and center of the youth and young adults of our communities, encouraging them to come to see for themselves what he was about, giving them direct access to the scriptures and so on? And how do you go about persuading them to take a look at Jesus, to maybe even to fix their eyes upon Jesus? Take your own notes, write down what you're thinking, what you're coming to see for yourself. Then I'll hear from my two friends, we'll hear from some of you. We'll take a little break and I'll make a proposal. Well, you're starting to talk to your neighbor. Why don't you talk to your neighbor? Tell your neighbor what you're thinking, what you're coming to see for yourself, what's occurring to you. Feel free to agree with me, disagree with me, add to what I've been saying, or whatever. So go to work for 3 minutes with your neighbor, and then we'll come back and hear from Marcus and Slander as well. take another minute. We'll come back together. Let me invite Skander and Marcus to give us a little response again, and then we'll open it to yourselves, to the floor.
Yeah, so the first question was how to respond to Jesus as a center of all faith. Our experiences, as we talked about it now, is that it's so important to young and adults to experience Jesus in their own life, to experience through practices to share communion, to learn how to pray and pray together in groups, and to worship together, and also try the challenges of Jesus' teaching in their own everyday life.
What might persuade people to at least learn from Jesus Christ? I would say one aspect that we've been mentioning before is the acts of service. Not just talk about it would be nice to be kind to poor people, or sort of show a movie of how someone is kind to someone else, but actually practice compassion and love towards poor people. We ourselves have taken a lot of young people on our confirmation trips to orphanages, and there been able to see how churches are working with young people in very difficult situations, where they themselves are actually able to share and participate in loving other people.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you both. Other comments, strategies, effective ways to go about it? Is that a hand over there? Thank you. We get you the microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, I would very much agree with you too, because young people I work with who are not from Christian families, they would say, oh yeah, they will be interested in 5 minutes, and then they said, yeah, and then we have Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and a lot of other persons who gave their lives for their friends. Mm-hmm. What makes him special? And then I have to have an answer, and my answer is because, like one of the African theologians said, no other God has wounds. He was the only one who could choose. In every moment of his life, he could say, oh, let's skip this, and he chose to stay with us. Great. Gandhi was in a situation that he had to flee or handle. He couldn't say, no, thank you, I want another setting, this. And the other one, and the thing that is some way appealing to these young people is because my belief is that he's still an acting, living reality today.
Yes.
He's my friend and morning star, and he's the one who helps me with trivial stuff. The one I'm nagging at, and who is nagging at me, and debating with. I'm very seldom have these nice prayer moments. I argue with him all the time, throughout the days, and he's never.
I think he can handle it. I think.
Yeah, he's not very easy to,
No.
But so, and that is because, and then it comes to, is what I say relevant or not?
Yeah.
I have a very interesting. We have a young group of Muslim men in my neighborhood who started a new organization called Hope, Love, and Faith. No, yes, faith, hope, love. And I said to them, yeah, I like that name, Yeah, we assumed you would. But they refer to me, it's me and the imam, We two are, because we are there.
And we can learn from the others. We can always learn from the neighbors. Yeah. And of course, we're not the only people among whom God has been present, or for whom God has a saving will. So we have to one of the doctrines of our faith is the universality of God's love. So, but then that doesn't mean it's all one is as good as another and it really doesn't matter and take it, whatever you're having yourself. There is a power to the Christian notion of Jesus and God's presence in Jesus. And then when you get on into this fantastic stuff, see, I think as Christians we don't believe half of it ourselves. That this God died, was put to death for us, and that somehow his death conquered death. Not just for him, but for us. I mean, it's all just an amazing faith. But I suppose we've become so routinized into saying it and thinking it and maybe even believing it a little that it almost becomes ordinary and everyday. Whereas in fact it's fantastic. It's mind-boggling, blowing. It's infinity. And that this God, that we can talk to this God, that God knows me by name, has knit me together in my mother's womb. I mean, you can pile on all these things. There's nothing comparable by way of a faith. There's certainly no better one, but there's no comparable one. Which doesn't mean that we can't learn from other people. Of course we can. When Jesus said, go into your room and close the door and be quiet and meditate, I never knew how to do that until I met and encountered the work of Thich Nhat Hanh. Taught me how to meditate. I'm deeply confronted by my Muslim colleague who gives 2.5%, not just of his income, but of his capital to the poor every year. Zakat, this extraordinary Muslim practice, confronts me every time. Now, I'm not going to start doing that myself, but I'm certainly inspired by it. I'm certainly inspired by it. Or these Muslim friends who kneel 5 times a day. I'm not going to buy a prayer mat and turn toward Mecca, but I can see that and say, I should raise my mind and heart more regularly to God throughout the day. So we can inspire each other, we can learn from each other, and yet, and Jesus in many ways said it best, in my Father's house there are many mansions. And yet this is our home within God's family. It's a rich home, an amazing home, an extraordinary life-giving one. We can learn from the neighbors, but we have a treasury here. Often in earthen vessels, of course. Let me push on a little bit. Well, maybe we'll take our break. Well, let me hear somebody else. Let me give you... Yes, oh, please, over here. Sorry, poor lateral vision. Yeah, a microphone.
2 weeks ago, I had a small group with youths. We were planning 3 gatherings for this autumn.
Planning what?
Gatherings for youth. We were talking about what we want and what this would be. And the main thing they talked about was that they want it to be something for real. Something with ground.
Yes.
And it should be really clear what we want to tell. And they want to invite others and,
yes,
of course, and meet other Christian youth.
But they wanted something for real.
Yes.
Yes. No, it has to be for real.
It was really confirming for me to hear this, because often we are really afraid of being clear about the gospel and what we want to tell them. So it's... it was something new for me. I heard it before, but again, they told me that they want to hear it for real.
And today's gospel reading in the Common Lectionary says, all this I have told you, so that my joy may be yours, your joy may be complete. So why do we want to tell them? Because we know it can be a source of great joy, of great hope, of great resource, of great truth, of great wisdom for their lives. So we have to have that joy in it, or else if we're just doling out Christian doctrines and dogmas in palatable doses or something, why would they pay much attention? But if they can recognize the joy in our faith, hey, they'd want to share that maybe. Yeah. One more before we go to break. Another thought, comment, insight somebody's having? Okay, yourself, sir. There you go. And then we'll take a break and we'll come back and I'm going to tell you how to do it.
In Sweden today, people are very much Christian and non-Christian are very interested and they're working a lot for morals and people's rights and there's a lot of talk about racism and women's rights and stuff like that. And people do know what's right and wrong. And without Jesus, I'm thinking we could bring Jesus in and tell them that he's way before his time. He stood for this is right and wrong. And without Jesus, it doesn't matter. Because in a long enough perspective of time,
or it's just a philosophy, or but when you can say, this is that human rights is God's will, revealed in Jesus, that this is the way to live. So you can make the argument from philosophy, from sociology or something, but when you can say to people, this is how people of God are to live, you've got a whole other conversation, a whole other rationale, a whole other persuasion.
Yeah.
And then you can tell great stories.
And if you don't believe in Jesus, it's just like you will get born, live and die.
Yeah.
And in a long enough time perspective, nothing will matter.
No.
The consequences aren't there if there isn't an eternity perspective to it.
Yeah, and I think that's when people can become destructive, because it's very difficult to live well without some kind of ultimate horizon, or some sense of ultimate meaning, or great backdrop, or presence with a capital P. It's very difficult to live well and live meaningfully without that. Or it's a lot more likely to live well with that kind of a sense of faith. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your comments. 5 minutes and we'll come back and regather, take it a step further, and then we'll wind down by 12:30 for lunch. Just stretch your legs if you would.
Finns det här?
Ja, alltså det heter inte så, det heter IMM.
Och det är kopplingen som är det, tror jag.
Jo, men precis. Jag försökte nog springa.
All right, we'll regather for a little while. Well, I know we're cutting off good conversation, and that's very unfortunate. But we still have miles to travel. And this afternoon you can look forward to the presentation from Marcus and Skander, and then I'll respond a little to them this afternoon. I just want to do something on what's our best approach to teaching this faith. When we go about it deliberately, what's the more effective pedagogy? Because it's not like teaching math or science. It can't be. We're trying to form people's being. We don't want them just to become theologians. We want them to become Christians. We don't want them just to know about justice. We want them to become just. We don't want them just to know about human rights. We want them to become passionate, committed to human rights. We don't want them just to know about Jesus. We want them to become disciples, perhaps. Or at least we want to teach in a way that might so dispose them. We need to inform them in the faith in ways that help to form them in the faith, and maybe even transform them. In other words, lifelong conversion. So it's not just like teaching math or science, although good math teachers want people to fall in love with math, and good science teachers want you to think scientifically. Good literature teachers want you to love literature and maybe write a poem or two. But it's even more deliberate when it comes to Christian religious education. In many ways, it's an ontological affair. Ontos, from the Greek, your being. You're trying to inform the being of people. And in English, we use being as a noun and as a verb. And in a sense, I mean it both ways. We're trying to form who they are and how they live their lives. So you're interfering in people's lives with very deliberate intent on influencing who they become. What's the best way of going about that? It's dangerous stuff. Yeats, again, he's my favorite poet, has a lovely poem about the teacher, and he says, tread softly. You could tread in my dreams. He warns the teacher to tread softly, because you could tread on their dreams. You could crush their dreams. How to teach youth and young adults? I think we're to teach Jesus, and I think we're to teach what Jesus taught. But I'm also proposing that perhaps we might have something to learn from how he taught. Now, that's a bit naive in our time and place, isn't it? He didn't have overheads, he didn't have PowerPoint, and yet he's described as a teacher and as teaching 150 times. Maybe it's 152, but it's about 150 times. In other words, it's his primary description. Who was he? He was a teacher. Jesus the teacher. And I would say that our approach should at least be consistent with his, and we can learn a great deal to learn from him. So let me ask you, imagine, what was his approach? When you think about how did Jesus go about it, what immediately occurs to you? Tell me. Let's hear 4 or 5 suggestions. Don't be afraid to state the obvious yourself. Pardon? He sits down. He often sits down and talks to them. Yes, indeed, to get into conversation. Very much so. Storytelling, powerful storytelling. And stories that enter into their lives, that draw them into their lives, to get them to stop and look at their lives. Powerful with his storytelling. Yourself? Ask questions. I read it recently, some scholar counted. We always think of Jesus preaching, teaching, preaching. He asked questions something like 313 times in the 4 Gospels. Amazing, asking questions constantly.
He also gave us an instruction. I mean, he says to his disciples before he leaves, love each other like I love you.
Yes. Yes, no, he definitely is. He gives instruction, there's no doubt about it. And he does it with authority. They said in Mark chapter 1, verse 20, 21, right at the beginning, they said, but he teaches with authority. So he wasn't just a discussion leader. He was a good listener and a good questioner, but he also had a powerful word to say.
He very seldom goes into the area of philosophical or religious language. He's often talking about farmers or women sweeping floors.
Yeah,
Like that.
making bread and sowing seed and birds of the air, lilies of the field, merchants in search of fine pearls. Yeah, no, there's very little philosophical stuff there. It's always very concrete, very historical, about people's lives. It's always about their lives, the ordinary and the everyday of their life. Another one you'd suggest? Well, in many ways you've said it all already. His approach, his overall approach throughout his public ministry, welcoming and inclusive, distinguished by his outreach, by his radical inclusion, and by calling people to participate in his work for God's reign from the very beginning, calling disciples, sending them out, calling 12, calling 72 others, sending them out 2 by 2 to participate with him. It was very unusual in the world of the time. In the world of the time, the teacher waited for students to come to him or her, never went out looking for them, whereas he's out in the highways and the byways and the marketplaces looking for disciples. And when he gets a few disciples, he says, come join me in this work. Peter, let's go fish for people. Taking other people in to participate. So there's no sense of Jesus the guru, which would have been the dominant image of the educator, at least in the Greek world of the time and in the Jewish world of the time as well, the authority that you appealed to. But he's out there saying, let's go, let's find more people, let's bring them. And then, of course, his full exclusion of women among his disciples is rather extraordinary in the world of the time. And he's interacting with women throughout his ministry. The Samaritan woman at the well. Remember, they came back from the village and were amazed to find him talking to a woman. In the world of the time, it would have been extraordinary. And yet it's very clear that all 3 synoptics make it clear that the women at the foot of the cross had come up from Galilee with him. In other words, were with him from the beginning and throughout. And of course are with him at the end. Tremendously respectful of the people he was teaching. Very much intent on empowering people as agents of their faith instead of dependents. Saying to people, so many times when he heals somebody, the woman with the hemorrhage, blind Bartimaeus, the leper who comes back, repeatedly when he has healed somebody, he says, your faith has saved you. He could have said, well, as the Son of God, I just healed you. Never does. But constantly says to people, your faith has saved you. Or imagine him in the Sermon on the Mount saying, you are the poor unlettered peasants. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. Don't let your light be hidden under a bushel basket. Just extraordinary affirmation. And constantly spoke the language of the ordinary, everyday people rather than philosophical language or anything else. Did it all the time. And then a deep compassion and commitment to justice. It was the defining feature of his public ministry, his compassion toward all in need. And then the works of justice and peacemaking were at the heart of his ministry. And there the scholars, of course, point to his preaching of the reign of God as the central theme of his ministry. Pardon me? Please.
In this church that we're sitting in now, it's incredibly soft place. The congregational newspaper of this church, there was an article discussing the language of the church and the practice of church language with all words that you mentioned. And the discussion was briefly that we need to keep a certain language for the Christian faith, and this language has to be taught and exercised and trained to be able to fully understand what it is to live a Christian life. Now, you're saying quite the opposite, that Jesus is quite wondering words and means and teachings. Could you just give us your thoughts on language in relation to Christian practice and the importance of all the order, or it's not important? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think every community develops its own native language and patterns of speech, and they become familiar, they become helpful, they become identifiable, they nurture people in that identity. He constantly talked about the reign of God, for example, and built on that, and it became a common pattern. He constantly talked about, you know, the light of the world and the salt of the earth and all this kind of imagery. So it was just that my point is, I don't think I'm saying that he didn't use that kind of, he didn't use standard language, but he used the ordinary language of people. Like you can imagine him saying to a bunch of fishermen and women down sorting fish, because the big topic of the time was the reign of God. What is it like? What will it be? When will it come? Is it a political reign? Is it a suffering servant? Is it when the lion will lie down with the lamb and the swords beaten into plowshares? Or is it that we'll kick the Romans out and drive them into the sea? All kinds of debate. But you can imagine him saying to these fishermen, you know, and that you can imagine him down there at the lake shore, and they're talking about the reign of God, and he's saying to them, you know what the reign of God is like? It's like a bunch of people sorting fish. And they'd say, no. What do you mean? Well, he says, the little ones you throw back in, the dead ones you give to the birds, the good ones you put in a basket to bring to market. But he was also turning their world upside down with that, because they thought as children of Abraham and Sarah that by birth they would belong. But he's saying, no, there'll be a sorting. And so he constantly used the ordinary language. Now, it becomes a codified language for us, but it shouldn't be a secret language. It shouldn't be a secret code. And it's not a privileged knowledge. Like that, there's a whole heresy in the early church called Gnosticism, which you had to know the right formulas and the right truths, and it wasn't available to everybody. And you had to be the inner circle. But that's not Jesus at all. Now, particular people will have an identifiable language, and we need that, and we need ways to talk about it, because, of course, these first Christians found themselves bamboozled by the whole business of, was he God? Well, the thought began to think he was. And then the emperor came along and said, well, why don't you worship me? You're worshiping a God already. You're worshiping a human man as a God, so why don't you worship me? And then the Christians had to say, oh, but you are not a God the way he was a God. Well, then what do you mean he was a God? And then they started borrowing the technical language in Greek philosophy, homoousios, homoiousios, you know, and all kinds of technical terms to try to articulate a very complicated mysteries, like 3 in 1, that God is one and yet three. And you get all kinds of words like consubstantial. But they're trying to, so in a sense, we had to develop a theology, and yet the theology should always remain at the service of the faith, at the service of the community, rather than becoming a coded Gnosticism for the chosen few. Thank you. Focusing on his approach, evident in explicit events, especially in the parables, his overall dynamic, I would propose to you, and some of you have heard me say this many times already, indeed have taught it and learned it and written about it, leading people from life to faith to life, and sometimes life in faith. But it's an amazingly simple process, beginning with people's own lives, leading them to the faith, but then encouraging them to bring that faith back to life again. He did so by beginning with people's ordinary and everyday lives. Fishing, farming, homemaking, women making bread, shepherds losing sheep and going looking for them, weddings, wakes, banquets, people in debt, people in poverty, people begging, people looking for a day's work. Vineyard keepers looking for people to harvest I mean, it's just all over the place. Constantly beginning with people's ordinary everyday lives. I defy, and I've said this a number of times, and I'm sure some good scripture scholar is going to take me up on it and probably prove me wrong. I don't know of a single instance of Jesus explicitly teaching that he doesn't begin with people's ordinary everyday lives and with the stuff that matters to their ordinary everyday lives. We may not know that it mattered as much as it did to them, but it mattered a great deal, the issues that he raised up in people's lives. And beggars at the gates were very, very common experiences for people. And so to begin there and in his preaching of his gospel was rather amazing. Always began with people's ordinary everyday lives and with their ordinary everyday language, but then often brought them to reflect on their lives, to probe, to analyze them, and sometimes to see them in a whole new way. Brought them to a new perspective. As I said already, that the Samaritan is the neighbor, that the prodigal is welcomed home, that Lazarus goes to heaven, and you can go on. And and things that we even, little things like, in the world of the time, the teachers were served by their pupils. So you can imagine him saying to his pupils, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve. They'd have said, who? What? I mean, you're a teacher. No, but I'm not that kind of teacher. So very often turned their world upside down, got them to see in a whole new way. He definitely taught them with authority. So he wasn't just a discussion leader. He began with their lives, got them to reflect on their lives, brought them to the gospel, taught them the gospel, preached it with authority, but then always preached it, and especially in his preaching of the reign of God, it was always to encourage people to see for themselves, to come to personal conviction, and with freedom. Left them very free, didn't threaten, didn't browbeat, left them free to choose. When John chapter 6, they come to him saying, hey, you've got to tone it down. A lot of people are upset, are walking away. He says, would you also go away? Leaves them very free. Rich young man comes to him looking for the ways to eternal life. He tells him, and he goes away sad. But Jesus doesn't run after him. It's all over the place in the gospel, the freedom of faith. And manipulation, threat, I think is unworthy of the gospel. But then always constantly invited people to some kind of decision, to go do it, to live it, to not just believe it, but to implement it, to follow the way as disciples, in a community of disciples, for God's reign on earth as in heaven. That dynamic of life to faith to life, you see it throughout his public ministry. I think you see it writ large on the road to Emmaus. And I did this yesterday with my friends. Let me do it one more time with you. It's an extraordinary text. It's in Luke chapter 24. And just watch his pedagogy. That's the key. Watch him at work. Now it's the risen Christ on the road, etc. But you find the exact same pedagogical dynamic in John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman at the well, except I don't know that one by heart. I should. You find it in Acts chapter 8 with the Ethiopian eunuch. Exact same pedagogy. So Luke, the great storyteller, must have paid particular attention to Jesus' pedagogy and was able to craft this type of story. It begins by saying that very same day, it's Easter Sunday morning, two of the disciples, are making their way to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles distance from Jerusalem, discussing as they went along all that had happened. In other words, talking about their life. What else would they be talking about? They've been shattered, they've been traumatized, their beloved Jesus has been crucified on them. They've lost hope, they admit that. Later they say, we were hoping. Some scholars say that Emmaus was a Roman garrison. Maybe they were going over to the enemy. Whyever, they're stumbling out of Jerusalem on Easter Sunday morning, lost and bewildered. In the midst of their lively exchange, Jesus himself approached and began to walk along with them. Now, just imagine yourself on the road, perhaps, walking along with them. It's extraordinary that he just simply joins their company and walks with them. The great question to ask is, why didn't he introduce himself? Why didn't he just simply tell them what to see? I would have, if I was the risen Christ. And instead, he never tells them. But instead, he says to them, what are you discussing as you go upon your way? In other words, tell me your story. What's going on in your life? What's happening? And they looked at him, bewildered, and they said, they turned to him looking sad. Then one of them, Cleophas by name, said to him, are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that went on there these past few days? I mean, where have you been? And he said to them, I mean, what rock have you been hiding under, you know? He says to them, what things? Now that's extraordinary, because nobody knew better than he what went on in Jerusalem. these past few days, wouldn't you say? And yet he wants them to tell him their story. He knows the pain, the trauma, the brokenness in their lives. He wants them to name it, reflect on it, tell him about it. And he draws them out. He must have drawn them out, because we only have a summary in Luke. They said all the things that had to do with Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet, powerful in the eyes of God and all the people, how our chief priest took him and had him crucified. So that's their version of the Easter story. And we were hoping, he was the one who would set Israel free. Besides all this, some women of our group went to the tomb before dawn. They come back to say that they saw a vision of angels who declared that he is alive. Some of the men of our group went to the tomb and saw nothing. So basically we're getting out of there. Now you've got their life on the table, their traumatized story, their shattered vision. He draws it out. Then he says to them, he's not a false liberal. He doesn't say, oh, well, if that's how you feel about the Easter story, that's fine with me. No, he pushes back. Because you'll often meet people with distorted stories, with destructive stories. And one of your functions will be not just to draw out their story, but sometimes to challenge their story. And to get them to stop believing destructive, negative, diminishing, demeaning stories about themselves especially. Because we all have the stories that tell us who we are and the stories we tell. He starts then, he says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. In other words, now he goes into the faith of the community. He starts with our life, he moves to the faith. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interprets for them every passage of Scripture that referred to himself and explained that the Messiah had to so suffer so as to enter into his glory. So in other words, he sets up a dialectic, and you'll often do that too. To go back to the comment my friend here made, that they'll often, what they say that it means and what it really means can often be miles apart. And you'll respect what they've said, but you'll also push back against. Because he now says, hey, this Messiah had to suffer. He wasn't a political Messiah. So they take it and, well, now what have you? Well, you've got their life on the table. You've got the faith on the table. And talking about the table, it says, by now they are near the village to which they were going. He acted as if he was going further. But they offer him hospitality, which in Luke is key to coming to see God, to see the presence, to recognize. When you offer hospitality, that's a particularly graced moment. So they pressed him. They said, stay with us. The day is far spent. So he went in to stay with them. And when he seated himself with them at table, in some ways he becomes the host, which would have been unusual. He was a guest in the home, and yet he takes the initiative. And regarding the bread, it says he took it, he blessed it, he broke it, he gave it. And with that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And the Greek verb there, some of you heard me say this already, is epigenoschein, which means they were deeply bonded with him. They knew him in the very marrow bone of their lives. It's the same verb in Greek for lovemaking. They fell in love with him again. They were deeply bonded. When Mary says, how can this be since I know not man? The verb there is epigenoschein. So they were deeply bonded with him, united with him in the deep heart's core of their lives. Whereupon he vanished from their sight. Why did he disappear? I think his work was done because they'd come to see for themselves. Amazing how he never tells them what to see, but allows them to come to see. Waits and waits, and how difficult it is to wait for them to come to see for themselves. Whereupon they got up immediately and they said, weren't our hearts burning inside of us? As he explained the scriptures to us upon the road. It's not just a systematic theology that we have to teach. We have to try to get people's hearts burning. Now, a good theology can help to that end. Don't mishear me. I make my life, my living as a theologian. But we don't want them just to become theologians. We want them to become Christians and disciples. So the heart has to be burning. Somehow he got their hearts burning as he explained the scriptures to them upon the road. But they get up immediately and they return to Jerusalem. In other words, they go from life to faith and then back to a life in faith. Because you can't just toddle on home and say, wasn't that interesting? Sorry, didn't recognize you. Yourself, no. You have to go back. They have to re-engage the community. They go into the community in Jerusalem. They're greeted with, the Lord has been raised. It is true. He has appeared to Simon. And I always ask the question, well then, why didn't they believe the women when the women came from the tomb? But he has appeared to Simon, so it's official now. And then it says, I love how the Jerusalem Bible translation ends, and it says, and then they told their story of what had happened on the road and how they'd come to know him in the breaking of the bread. And it's the bread of Eucharist. It's a very liturgical passage. You have the liturgy of the Word on the road. You have the liturgy of the Eucharist at the table. But it's the bread of life, the bread of relationships, the bread of friendships, the bread of parenting, the bread of trying to be authentic, trying to establish relationships with them and so on. It's an amazing text, and yet I think it epitomizes how not only the risen Christ, but how the Jesus of history went about it. He walked with them, and very often that's as much as you can do, drew out and listened to their sad story, their shattered vision, retold the story and vision of the faith community, and yet enabled them to see for themselves. And then they choose to return. The life to faith to life, it's a mode of teaching, it's a mode of evangelizing. I think it's important to encourage our young people to share their faith. One of the best ways to grow in faith is to give it away. How many of you would say that your faith has been nurtured by your efforts to share it? It's like a no-brainer, isn't it? And this is one of the geniuses of the catechumenate that we've revived from the early Christian communities, because the catechumenate recognized that if you could get people involved in sharing their faith with newcomers, it wouldn't just socialize the newcomers into Christian identity, it would revive the faith of the old hands as well. In other words, trying to share this faith is a powerful way of nurturing it. So I think getting our young people, instead of saying they're in need of evangelization, so they are. They're in need of pre-evangelization, so they are. But also encourage them to begin to share their faith. I think there's a real opportunity for young people to re-evangelize their parents. And why not? I'd give you a good example of it. My Jewish neighbors across the streets from me in Boston, and I believe this was evangelization on my part. Their daughter, a lovely little girl, Emma, is a dear friend to Teddy, his best friend. She's 2 years older than he. But Emma, they're a Jewish family, but they're just cultural Jews, didn't practice their faith. And Emma, as a young girl, about 9 or 10, came to me and said, Tom, I really would love to find out what it means to be Jewish, but my mom and dad have no interest in teaching me. And I said, well, why don't we go to Sabbath school? Why don't you enroll in Sabbath school? Oh, they wouldn't enroll me in Sabbath school. They don't want me to learn about it. They think it's to be a waste of time, waste of money. But I'd love to learn about it. So I was out to dinner with the family about a week later, and I'd had a couple of glasses of wine, if I be honest. And I said to these parents, I think it's a disgrace that you're not allowing your child to become a Jewish, to learn her Jewish tradition. It's a wonderful, rich spirituality. Why would you deny her access to it? And they said, who are you to be telling us that we raise our kid Jewish? That she wants to be raised Jewish. Why would you deny her? So they went down to their Jewish synagogue and they enrolled her in Sunday school, or in Sabbath school, and then they came and the mom, a dear friend, knocked on my door and said, you wouldn't happen to have $2,500 to lend us, would you? Because that's what it was. That's what it was to enroll in Sabbath school, $2,500 for the year. But she went for 3 hours a day. She went twice a week. She went for 3 hours twice a week on Wednesdays and Sundays, and she's become a devout, practicing young Jewish woman. She's done bat mitzvah and the whole bit. And guess what? Now the family is celebrating Shabbat and keeping Passover and at least once in a while going to synagogue. I consider that evangelization. I brought them back to their Jewish faith. Now, if they ever ask me about Christian faith, I'm happy to explain that too. But I think children have a potential to bring people back to their faith. And even if they come out of, there is a whole generation, I think, that missed out on good religious education and catechesis and so on. And a lot of them are parents now. But why they can, even if young people come in with very little of the language of the tradition, they can have the seed of faith. They can have that spark of faith. and it'll need to be taught and informed and all the rest of it, informed and transformed. But that initial seed could be there, and I think we can work with it. I think a sure way to grow people in faith is to get them to give it away, often through one-on-one conversation, encourage our youth and young adults to share their faith, the genius of the catechumenate, to evangelize. They're to evangelize and not to proselytize. Proselytizing is telling people what they should believe. Evangelizing is telling people what you believe. And you're always entitled to tell people what you believe. You're not entitled to tell them what they should believe. Carolyn, you're going to say, please.
Can I?
Please.
Yeah. Because I was thinking about the task to preach. And for many young people, as far as I know, and in my research, I can see that they are not so comfortable in going into church and to the service. And if they come to the service, they don't understand the preaching. And then I wonder, can you see your movements and your thoughts about education in relation to the service? Can you see you haven't heard my question. Have you heard my question?
Please, go ahead, yes.
I go ahead. I was asking about the tasks to preach. And when, as far as I can see in my research, young adults don't feel that comfortable in going into church. And when they come to church, they don't understand what's going on. And sometimes they don't feel that the priest make any sense to them.
Yeah.
So actually my question is if you can see your movements in relation to the task to preach in the service, can we work in the same way?
Can you preach this way?
Yes, exactly.
I think you can.
Because how can we give space for their thoughts?
Yeah, I think you can. And I think we have to. And I think it's the simplest thing in the world. This is not rocket science. In fact, I'm embarrassed. I get invited around the world to explain this, and I'm embarrassed how simple, how obvious it is. To begin with people's lives, to bring them to the faith, and to bring that back to life again. A great sermon, I heard one about 3 Sundays ago. The text was Matthew, I think it's chapter 11, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest," and so on, was the gospel reading. And I was in church twice that weekend, because I was a reader on Saturday and evening at a church, at a mass, and then on Sunday morning a friend of mine was having a baby baptized, so I went twice. So the fellow on Saturday afternoon began by saying this interesting gospel reading in this pericope for Matthew's gospel, in today's gospel reading, and just went on and on about in today's gospel reading. Now I was in the sanctuary because I was the lector, and I could see people literally turning off. 2 minutes, 3 minutes at most. If you're preaching, you better be a real powerful preacher and scholar to simply begin with, in today's gospel reading. Because you're starting with the faith. You've got to pre-evangelize first. The second fellow, and unfortunately in my church, it's still only fellows that we have, but one day the arc of history may be long, as Martin Luther King said, but it always bends toward justice. So we will have priests someday, women priests, but for now we have only men priests. But the second priest the next morning stood up and said to people, "How many of you came to church this morning feeling a bit burdened?" Everybody put up their hand. Well, already you feel a little bit better. You know, my burdens are probably no worse than hers, you know. And then he went on, now where do we get the burdens? Who put the burdens on us? Why do we have them? How do we carry them? Where do they come from? Are they real? Are they imagined? He talked about burdens, the burdens we carry. Life. And then he says, and how often and how do you bring your burdens to Jesus? And when you bring your burdens to Jesus, can he help you carry them? Or do you have to still carry them all by yourself? Then he went into the gospel reading. But you could literally see people sitting up and saying, this is about my life. It's a very simple way to preach. And then, instead of, after you've laid out, you've engaged people's lives, you can do it with a story, with an example. In this morning's newspaper, you can always begin. It was Barth's old conviction. You preach the gospel with the morning paper. You preach with the morning paper in one hand and the gospel in the other. And if you don't do that, if you just do your exegesis, I don't think people will hear it, and young people especially won't hear it. And then you bring them back. to life again. And very often sermons become what I call salad at that point. They become lettuce. Lettuce be nice, lettuce be good, lettuce and tomato, lettuce. You get the salad time. And let us all pray, let us all hope, let us. Don't end with lettuce. End by saying, how are we going to live this coming week? I don't know how about you, but I know what I'm going to do. And then you volunteer what you're going to try to do with it this coming week, rather than just pious piffle at the end. Life to faith, faith to life. It can be done very readily. And I think if you preach that way, you also want to consider having a youth liturgy or a youth worship. Many of our parishes have youth masses, as we call them, and they're very popular with young people. And then you begin with I want to say you too or something, but then I'm dating myself. Certainly not Miley Cyrus, but whatever. You begin with something out of their youth culture and reality, and then you bring that to the texts to bring it back to their lives again. I think there's a way to preach in this regard. Thank you. Great question. To evangelize, not to proselytize, sharing without imposing. 1 Peter 3:15 says, do it with gentleness and respect. How do you evangelize? How do you get young people to share the faith the way Jesus did? Invite them to share their own life. Get people to tell their story. Ask them, elicit their story, draw it out. And often push back against, too. You won't just canonize their story. When they told their story on the road to Emmaus, he pushed back and said, how slow you are to believe. You know what? You missed the point, you people, a lot of the time. How slow you are to believe all that the prophets had announced. And then he instructs them. So you get them to tell their story, you elicit their story, but then you share with them the Christian story and vision, insofar as it's applicable and engaging for their lives, and do it according to the mode of the receiver. So that's when you have to stop and say, who are these young people? So if I just go on with my technical, sophisticated, theological language, if it doesn't speak to young people's hearts, it's not likely to be heard. But then invite them to see for themselves and then to integrate the wisdom of Christian faith into their ordinary everyday lives. Let me say, that's for explicit pedagogical moments, you can imagine this life to faith to life approach as a focusing activity around a generative theme. In other words, something of real interest to their lives, and then 5 pedagogical movements. Now, many of you are already very familiar with this. I can say it very briefly, and then we'll hear from Marcus and Skander, and we'll hear from you as well and wind down. The life to faith to life dynamic, you can imagine it, as I said, you can begin by focusing it around something of real interest to young people, a theme, a symbol, an attitude, whatever it might be. You invite their own expression around the theme, and you get them to reflect on it critically in conversation, and that's very much their own story and vision. You get their own stories and visions out around the theme of whatever the theme might be, their own praxis, if you will, or their own theory. You're asking their praxis rather than their theory of the theme. Then you give access to the story and vision of Christian faith as pertinent to the theme, the symbol, the group, and so on. But then in moving back to life again, you're encouraging them to appropriate it, to integrate it, to make it their own. This is the moment of seeing for themselves, and then you invite them to decision for a lived faith. Let me give some examples. A retreat, young adult retreat we did recently in my parish. I helped to co-anchor it. We did a reflection with them on their image of God. And you begin by saying, folks, perhaps the most important thing you'll ever think about, and then the most important decision you'll ever make in your life, is what to make most important. What's going to be the most important thing in your life that will permeate everything else? Who and what will you put at the center of your life? Because as a human being, you're going to do that. Everybody does. One of the interesting findings from the faith development research is that everybody has a faith of some kind or other. Some center of value, as Fowler and Sharon Parks and these people who said that you put at the center of your life. So the most important decision you'll ever make in your whole life, because it'll permeate everything else, is who to put, what to put at the center of it all. In other words, who's going to be your God? And then we told the story. So you might give a little bit of an introduction, and in a sense you're borrowing from movement 3 to get the conversation started in the focusing activity. And then in our focusing activity, we told them the story of Michelangelo. Some of you have heard me say this already yesterday, so I'm boring you. But Michelangelo, when he was commissioned to paint God, Pope Leo commissioned him to paint God on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and Michelangelo ran away because he knew that he would fail and that he'd be the laughingstock of the artistic community. But in those days, you didn't say no to the Pope. Leo had him brought back under armed guard and told him to paint. And Michelangelo asked the Pope, "What should I paint?" And Leo, who was not famous for his piety at all, said, "You've got to find that in your own heart." And then we asked them the question. We gave them construction paper and crayons and pipe cleaners and all kinds of things, balloons. Okay, supposing you're Michelangelo, supposing you're commissioned to paint, to express your God. What God would you represent? What's your understanding of God, your language for God, your concept of God, or your felt sense, your bodily felt sense of God? Too often we leave the body out of spiritual, theological knowing. It belongs right at the center of it all. And they did. And it was fascinating what these young people came up with. And then movement 1 is simply getting them to share that in groups, in small groups. There was about 18 in the group, so we broke them into small groups and they talked. And there was a lot of fun and laughter and banter and everything else. Who is your God? What's the most important thing in your life? And people put in their iPad. And in some ways, they were being honest right now. That's probably the most important. But then you have them reflect on that. You have them question it, probe it, analyze it. You don't just settle for that. Push back against it. Where did they get this God? Who shaped it? Where did it come from? It's movement 2, critical reflection. And then movement 3, we basically use the story of the parable of the prodigal son, or the prodigal father. And it's an extraordinary text when you unpack it with young people. Many of them identify with the prodigal, of course. Very few identify with the good kid who stayed home, but you get them not to beat up on him either. And but you lay out this unconditional love of God, because the old father runs out full of compassion and welcomes him home before he can even apologize. But then movement 4 is bringing them back to life again. And in movement 4, very often after we've done instruction, we say to them, "Okay now folks, who is your God?" And they say, "Oh, yeah." But instead you want them to think about it, to see. You want to say, "Okay, is there anything shifting in your understanding of God? Do you want to? What kind of a God would you like to have? What kind of a God would be life-giving? How do you think God feels about the kind of God you have? How do you think God thinks and feels about the kind of image you have of God?" So movement 4, you're trying to get them to see for themselves. Movement 5 then, you invite them to decision. What you're going to put something at the center of your life. And you tell them the story of this God of Exodus who wants to set us free and keep us free, and could keep you free too. Could set you free and keep you living in freedom if you put this God at the center of your life. And probably any other thing you put at the center of your life will probably enslave you. Every idol does. So you let them know there's a lot riding on it, but you do invite them to decision. And sometimes they're not ready to talk about it, especially young people. You get them to journal, you get them to write it out, you put them in small groups, you do personal one-on-one mentoring with them, you have interviews with them, they talk about it when they come to see you. So it ran throughout a whole weekend. But it was basically life to faith to life around their own image of God. Let me give one more example. We'll hear from our friends and wind down. I hear from you as well. In doing this with Scripture, just to go back to the example that you were asking about, Lectio Divina. When we do it with them, we begin by, at least in the group, and this is an adult group that I work often, I don't work with anymore because I'm gone too often. But I've been with this group for many years, and they've been meeting for many years. And what they typically do is they begin by talking about their life. is the opening kind of focusing activity. They just check in, what's going on, troubles, joys, sorrows, whatever it is that's happening in their lives. And then the leader says something like, let us bring our lives to listen and to hear this text, and let us open our hearts to the possibility, at least to the possibility, that it could be a word of God for us. And then the rest of the focusing activity is to simply read the text, and to read it in a way that invites people to step into it, to be touched by it, to imagine it. There is a way to read it as if, reading the Holy Gospel according to John, diddly-diddly-diddly-do. But nobody hears it. So you try to read it in a way that people will bring their life to it. Then the movement one question, now there's many ways to do this and to use this in scripture scholarship. The movement one question is, what did you hear? What did it say to you? What stood out? What word seemed important to you? And I think even if they've no theological scriptural background, I think they can still respond to that. Where did it ring true? What did it speak to your heart? So don't ask them, what does that text mean? That's a theoretical question, theoria. There'll be room for that in movement 3. But at the beginning you ask them a praxis question. Where did it hit home? What did you hear? What stood out? And then movement 2 is why? Why do you think you heard that? What were you bringing to it? What are the memories? What does this help you remember? What does it help you imagine? Because that movement 2 is reason, memory, and imagination. And you reflect upon it, what they heard and why they heard and what it could mean for their lives. Then you have the instruction. Then you have the more deliberate. Pardon me, I'm coming down with something. The third movement is when you have people, when you give them access to the better scholarship and in-depth analysis, and the leader has spent some time and prepared. You've prayed with the text, you've thought about it, you've given some preparation to it, and that's when you can bring the best of good scholarship to the text, except you're not just looking to impress them with your knowledge of the Sitz im Leben, of the redaction principle or something. You're laying out the story, but you're also laying out the vision, what it means for their lives, where it's inviting us, where it's calling us, what it's asking, what it's demanding, what it's confronting within us, and so on and so forth. So there is that time when you unpack the text according to the faith of the church, the scholarship that's available, and so on. But then you don't tell them, and that's what it means for you. Instead you say, what do you think? Movement 4, what are you coming to see for yourself? What are you recognizing? What's emerging? Anything shifting for you? And then movement 5 is, well, if you ever took it seriously, what would you do? What would this mean? How would you take it, apply it, implement it, live it, whatever? You can ask all of these questions thousands of ways, but it's basically life to faith, faith to life. And sometimes you'll find yourself, as I said, in that movement 3, pushing back against stuff that they said in movement 1 and 2. And they're all, I use the word movements because they all shift and move around, and you could be in movement 1 and 2 and then in 3 and go back to 1 and 2 and then in 3 and back to 2 and 4. And it's like a symphony. All right. Take your pen and paper, and we're going to hear from our friends again here, but let me invite you to have a reflection on it. And in a sense, what I'm asking you now is obviously, what are you coming to see for yourself about youth and young adult faith in our time? What are the possibilities? What are the opportunities? Are there ways? Is there something here in this life to faith to life approach that could be helpful? Are there decisions that you want to make about faith on earth? Questions you might have, answers you might have, write it down, whatever it is. In a sense, I'm asking, what did you learn in school today? Write it down for yourself and for your work. Go back to the neighbor for 2 minutes, then we'll hear from Marcus and Skander again, and then we'll wind down and take ourselves off to lunch. They will lead our conversation in the afternoon, and I'll have the privilege of responding a little to them. For now, turn to the neighbor, have a chat. What did the neighbor learn in school today? What are you taking home that you might take and put to work? That's the question. Now, take 3 minutes, and we'll regather. Well, we better come back together for a little while. We don't want the soup to grow cold. Well, before we go to lunch, we'll go to lunch a little bit late, 5 minutes late, but let's hear a word from Marcus and Skander and Magnus and Skander, and then we'll hear a couple of comments from you. What can you take away from this? What could you put to work? What might be helpful?
Yes, we have actually been working with this model for a couple of years, from life to faith and faith to life, and what we first and foremost want to say is that this way of teaching is really helpful. It's really a great way to integrate young people with their own lives and with their faith, and so that is our first reflection. It's really working.
However, we have sometimes faced and seen a challenge. We have no problems with involving the young kids about the theme, and then telling a story from the Bible, and even telling the story from some sort of vision. But then when we're going to try to do the movement from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5, from sort of story and vision back to their own life, it has sometimes been a challenge to make them involved and try to understand how this story applies into their life. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, thank you both. It's the most difficult thing, the most difficult of all, because we're not accustomed to it. You know, I teach little kids in my parish, and you know, if I do a lesson on Jesus is our friend, even movement 4, if I say to them, so boys and girls, who is your friend? They'll all say, Jesus is my friend. But you want them, it's not recall. It's getting them to try to see for themselves. And so instead of saying, okay, who is your friend? They all say, Jesus is my friend. Instead you say, now, I think Jesus is your friend, but what do you really think yourself? Can you believe that? What does that tell you about Jesus? What does it tell you about yourself? What difference could it make? So, in other words, the movement 4 questions are the key to whether or not they come to see for themselves. Now, pardon me, that stranger on the road to Emmaus just hung in with them, you know, spent time with them. And eventually the penny dropped and they recognized him. And sometimes that's as much as you can do, but I do think there are ways to ask the question. Like, what's the best thing you heard here tonight? Or even just the one I just asked you. What did you learn in school today? Or last night I asked people, when you go home, pick somebody you love and bring them a gift from tonight's conversation. What will the gift be and who will you give it to? Now everybody had to figure out, I didn't tell them what gift to bring home and who to give it to. But I asked them, when you go home, some of you were there last night, what gift will you bring and to whom will you share it? So it's that type of personally engaging, encouraging them to see for themselves whatever they see, to make it their own, to appropriate it, to take it to heart. There's many ways to ask it and to set up the questions, but it is challenging. It's very challenging because they can often just parrot back, because very often this is a pedagogy that they're not accustomed to. Even in their, you know, what do you do in math class? You give the teacher the answer they're looking for, or whatever, what you think is the right answer. And I've had young people, I've taught undergraduates for many years at Boston College, and I'd have young people come up to me at that movement 4 and say, what's the answer? And you say, well, what do you think yourself? No, what's the answer? But you hang in there. You know, but it's a great question because it's the most difficult aspect. But they do get better at it. That with practice, they'll begin to pick it up. And that's the benefit of the whole process, that it could become what Aquinas called a habitus for life. In other words, the way they typically approach their faith. It becomes a part of them, that they move constantly, they bring their lives to their faith, and they try to bring their faith to their lives. So you're not just using it as an opportunity to teach them certain things. You want them to become a part of their own style, their own way of thinking about their faith in the world. And they'll constantly bring their lives to their faith and then their faith to their lives. So if you hang in with it, they do get it. Yeah, it's interesting too how Magnus said it does work. And one of the things that surprised me about it does work even in other cultures. I've done a fair amount of work in Korea, in China, in Asian cultures, where when first time I went to Korea, they said, Tom, you can't do it here. I want you to teach us about it, but we can't do it. They won't talk. You put them into small groups, they won't talk. And sure enough, the first morning, they wouldn't talk. Because in that culture, there's a deep culture of the teacher as guru. And you don't talk in the presence of the teacher. It was considered disrespectful. By the end of the second day, I couldn't get them to come back out of their small groups. It was almost like I unleashed an avalanche. So there are cultural challenges to it and different challenges, but I think it's possible to forge ahead. Great comments. One other comment before we go to lunch. What are you thinking? What are you bringing away? Anything helpful? Somebody got a word for us before we go? Yourself.
I like this last part, because what I recognize is that we often speak about our lives, we speak about the gospel and reflect and so on, but what I like is here sort of the direction towards the future, okay? What do we do now? What's the next step? What would you do this week? And for me, it's very clear that that's something I very rarely do.
Yes, I know.
To trust that, okay, so what do we do next?
Yeah.
I like that very much.
We presume that they'll take it and apply it. But why not make that a part of the pedagogy and a part of the conversation that you create? The soup will be getting cold. We'll see you all in the afternoon for a little while. Thank you very much. And off we go to lunch.
Och då är det lunch på hotell Birger Jarl. Ni behöver inte ens ta på er några ytterkläder utan ni går förbi receptionen och in på hotellet. Ni som inte hade anmält er och som har kommit till mig idag och skrivit på, vänta till sist. Jag hoppas att alla ska få mat, men vänta så att vi ser att vi får plats. Och lämna inga värdesaker här, för jag lovar inte att det är låst. Tillbaka här 1:30.
Käka lunch. Jättegod.